open doors. A visa-free waiver program for Ukrainians traveling to the EU is now in effect. Will this bring the country closer to the West, or is it just a tactic to isolate Russia? I'm Imran Garda, and today's Newsmaker is the Ukraine-EU relationship. It was a deal years in the making, and according to Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, it was the final exit for his country from the Russian Empire. Last week, thousands of Ukrainians arrived in the EU without a visa, all thanks to a waiver program that took effect. EU officials are hailing the move as a reward for Ukraine's reforms and a way to bring the country more into the West. But is Ukraine's fast-tracking towards visa-free status unfair to countries like Turkey, who have negotiated unsuccessfully for years for the same deal? And will Russia view the deal as further Western encroachment? Sandra Gutman reports from Kiev.
I'm going to Greece, to the Rhodes Island. I even hadn't visited an embassy or a visa centrum as I did before, and it was much quicker to organize the trip.
Alexandra is one of thousands of Ukrainians traveling to Europe without a visa for the first time in the country's history.
We all were waiting for that for a long time, and not only because the traveling became easier, but also going more far from Russia and coming closer to the place where we want to belong.
Trains like this one to Poland are now fully booked. All passengers traveling without visas need biometric passports and are only allowed a short stay for leisure or business. But they are the lucky few. A recent poll found that 70% of Ukrainians don't plan to use the visa-free regime at all in the next year because they can't afford to travel abroad. Ukraine's currency is weak. Incomes and pensions have shrunk. And according to UN data, nearly 60% of Ukrainians live below the poverty line.
If we really would like to have Ukrainians as a proper so to say, people assimilated to the European community, we need dramatically increase their income and purchasing ability.
For the government in Kiev, this was a milestone worth celebrating. A reward for 3 years of EU-prescribed reforms and resistance from some member countries wary of opening the bloc's borders to Ukraine.
Сказати, що чим більший прогрес ми демонструємо на шляху реформ, тим більше аргументів в мене і в українського народу з'являється для того, щоб надати Україні і перспективу членства в Європейському Союзі.
Ukraine has come a long way since the Maidan protests in 2014, which demanded an end to corruption and political ties to Russia. Ukraine's new anti-corruption bureau has been hard at work, exposing dozens of officials. Public workers are now required to declare their wealth online. But critics say some politicians are trying to water down reforms. Recently, lawmakers passed an amendment that requires NGOs, activists, and journalists to also declare their assets.
Our elites are still linked with those style of governance. They are still linked with oligarchs. Formally, we are much more closer to Europe, but we have still these links, not to Russia, but to Russian style of governance. And I hope the president someday will cut these links also.
Like the Soviet statue that towers over Kiev, Mother Russia is still a powerful presence. Many are wary of drawing closer to the EU in favor of abandoning Ukraine's other neighbor.
Ukraine is located between two superstates. We need to be pragmatic about what's best for our national interest. Of course, the EU and the US are important partners. So is China, Turkey, and Russia. They will not disappear from the world map. We need to build relations with all of them.
At Kiev's central station, the train from Poland has returned. Travelers say the visa-free system works well.
It's in Ukrainian that you are the passenger of the first visa-free train. And I think that everyone will remember this day because it's like a historic day for Ukrainians.
Of course, full membership to the EU is Ukraine's ultimate destination. But with a war to the east and an ongoing battle against corrupt elites, that journey will take far longer. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers in Kiev.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now by Emre Gurnin. He is an expert on Turkey-EU relations. From Kiev, Ivana Klimpush-Tsintsatse, the Vice Prime Minister of Ukraine on European integration. And from Girne in the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, hello, Nikolai Gorshkov. He's the Director and Editor-in-Chief at Sputnik News UK. Thanks all of you for joining us. Ivana, if I may begin with you, you must be happy. This is possibly a step closer to EU accession. But if I can point you towards what your President Poroshenko said. He said, this is the fall of the paper curtain. This is the final break with the Russian Empire. And then he quoted the 19th century poet Lermontov, and he said, farewell, unwashed Russia. Was that language helpful, ma'am?
Well, first and foremost, we have to understand that what we finally received as a visa-free regime with the European Union, this is because we, as Ukrainians, as the Ukrainian state, governments, parliament, the president, civil society, media, we have all worked together in order to fulfill all of 144 provisions of the Visa Liberalization Action Plan. And that means that we finally actually leapfrogged much further than anybody could have expected. But back in 2014, when we were out in the Maidan fighting the previous regime in Kyiv of former President Yanukovych. So therefore, I totally believe that this decision of the European Union is helping us to ensure that European integration of Ukraine is non-reversible, and that we are finally breaking with our colonial past of the Soviet Union and of the Russian Federation, which is trying to impose its, project its power over Ukraine and cannot let us go. And unfortunately, it's doing so also by illegally annexing Crimea and also by aggressively attacking Ukraine in the east by providing weapons, providing regular forces to the east of Ukraine and shells, and ensuring that the people of Ukraine are not safe on that territory.
Right, and you brought about the context quite well as to why it seems as if the Ukrainian president is thumbing his nose at the Russians. Nikolai Gorshkov, with this visa-free travel for Ukrainians into the EU, do they deserve it?
Well, every nation deserves a visa-free travel. The world should be a lot freer, and government state boundaries are basically an invention which wasn't there in all the days.
Okay, so let me ask you if it's a good thing.
It is a good thing for family travel, for tourism, for meeting friends, but I'm afraid for the Ukrainians, the way the Ukrainians understand visa-free travel, a lot of them, is for doing work in the EU, because the jobs in Ukraine are far and few between, and a lot of people have already been traveling to Europe as tourists and staying after their visas expired and working illegally and not paying taxes. It's a huge problem for Ukraine and for Moldova, for example, their nearest neighbor, that the jobs are not available in the countries and they're looking for every opportunity to work abroad. And that's what I think. Neither, there is a difference of opinion. The European Union believes it's a step forward in integrating Ukraine, but the Ukrainians believe it's an opportunity to get jobs in the West.
So let's ask Ivana. Ivana, for those Ukrainians who think they can get a job in Europe, now they can't, are they going to misread the situation and go and conduct illegal sort of employment activity, thinking that they can go to Europe now and find work?
No, I am absolutely sure that Ukrainians will be absolutely responsible travelers and will not be violating the visa-free regime provisions. And Ukrainian government, as well as our partners in the civil society, we are taking a very clear action to ensure that we have the information on the rules and procedures of using visa-free for Ukrainians being very clearly explained to every single Ukrainian citizen. And everybody knows very well that they can use visa-free specifically for tourism, for private visits, for B2B contacts, and we have to understand that this is also really increasing like business-to-business contacts, because now you don't have to stand in long lines and to gather all these huge piles of documents that you were supposed to do before applying for visa in any of the EU states and going to visa center. Now you can actually have the reason to go and for some conference, for some exhibition, to meet your partners, for negotiations to meet your partners, and actually just having your biometrical passport and having a reason why you are going and where you are going. And so I do not expect that there will be a flow of incoming Ukrainians that would be trying to violate these provisions.
Right. Good point. Let's bring in Emre Gönen as we broaden this out.
Yeah.
How does Turkey view this? First Georgia, now Ukraine, and you guys have been, I don't know, asking the father for a date for his daughter, you know, for years, and suddenly the father's marrying off the other girls, but wouldn't even give you a date with the other daughter.
I do not know. I have spent my youth as a university student in France, where Turkish nationals did not need any visa to travel within Europe. The only visas we needed were the ex-socialist countries. And the whole thing has changed starting from 1979. Because Turkish governments at that time wanted to get some control on the part of the European countries. Turkey was in a very dire situation regarding urban terrorism and everything. And this visa requirement stayed there. It stayed there. It should have been lifted by the year 2004, when the European Union Council of Ministers took the decision that Turkey was fulfilling the criteria for democratic countries, and accession negotiations had a green light to go. Usually it's a gesture. It's a gesture of the European Union, as it has been conveyed to Georgia and then to Ukraine. It's a goodwill gesture, you know, to offer some, how would I say, incentive for countries who are getting closer to the European Union. It's not the first step of the European membership. And I would remind the example of Turkey to all the other candidate countries. It's not an easy thing to join the European Union as a full member, especially in the present state of the conditions. But with Turkey, the whole thing has turned into a very sour discussion, tit-for-tat negotiation. And we have been offered so many times against other issues this visa-free travel right, and it is still pending.
Maybe you should have still been fighting with Russia.
Turkey has been fighting, I believe, 9 wars with the Russian Empire under the Ottoman Empire. We have won one, and there was one draw. So,
okay. But do you believe, I mean, the point I'm getting to is, do you believe that the others jumped ahead of the queue because it was political rather than actually weighing up who was a better candidate country?
Obviously, but everybody has jumped in front of Turkey within the queue regarding accession negotiations, regarding just anything.
Okay, so as I take that point and I pose it to Nikolai, Nikolai, is that the Russian perspective, that EU accession for the likes of Georgia and Ukraine is merely political and has nothing to do with economic, labor, legal reform and so on? Nikolai?
Yes, it is. It is political. Just look at the things as they stand. Yeah, Ukraine has leapfrogged to the visa-free regime, but it leapfrogged all the problems: corruption, lack of jobs, economic decline, lack of human rights, the anti-terrorist operation, which is branding about 5 million people in the east of Ukraine terrorists, all sorts of things. And the European Union wanted to give President Poroshenko a break from all the criticism he is getting at home, but also to snub Russia. So it's a kind of a two-pronged operation to show Russia a one-up thing, but also to help Poroshenko to give something to the people of Ukraine, because he can't do anything else.
Ivana, you're shaking your head in disagreement. Tell me why.
Well, first and foremost, because you're putting me on air with the representative of Sputnik, and according to even President of France, Macron, this is not a representative of the media, but this is a representative of propaganda, and I totally agree with President of France here. That's one thing. And definitely their messages would be trying to twist the reality, not really knowing what's exactly happening here in Ukraine.
Is he accurately representing the zeitgeist in Russia?
Let me finish this. If it was a political decision, we would have received this political decision without implementing 144 provisions of the Visa Liberalization Action Plan. It was not easy. It's not that it was an easy ride or a free ride. No, Ukraine is actually earning every single decision by the actions, but we are taking these actions specifically back home because we want to make sure that our people are living in a much better conditions, that our people are parting from the Soviet past, that our people will, even though right now we are still very seriously feeling the economic decline that was in part caused by the Russian aggression as well. Notwithstanding all of this, we have already, by the end of last year, we have shown 2.4% of the growth of GDP, and that's extremely difficult when you've lost 20% of your economy Ivana, to the war.
That's really good. If you'd allow me to come in here, because I am curious.
It's not a political decision.
Sure. If you'd allow me, and my apologies for interrupting, because we're out of time. We're running out of time very fast, but I want to get this in because I am curious about what's going to happen with the East and Crimea, which was annexed by Russia. How does that work? If you're a Ukrainian citizen and you live in Crimea, if you're somebody in the East and you're a pro-Russian separatist, do you also have that visa-free travel to Europe?
Ukrainian citizens who have not violated Ukrainian legislation, who have not been recordedly participating in fight against Ukrainian state, and if you were not, according to the law, taken to prison, then you are absolutely ready and capable of getting Ukrainian biometrical passport, and you can use the possibilities of traveling to EU countries, enjoying the visa-free regime. And so I hope that those Russian regulars who are on the East will not try to obtain Ukrainian passports and will not try to violate our internal legislation even further.
Okay, Emre Gönen, let me ask you what Turkey is going to do now, given the news of Georgia, given the news of Ukraine. How would President Erdogan be thinking now? He said last month that there's a new 12-month process. Would he be thinking, I'm going to use this as an opportunity to push the Europeans to give us visa liberalization? Or would he be looking at it as maybe the game is rigged and maybe we shouldn't bother?
I do not think that the gesture of the European Union towards Ukraine and Georgia should be instrumentalized by Turkey. Obviously, the Deputy Prime Minister has been talking about it. There are a conditionality period to be fulfilled, and Turkey has fulfilled this conditionality long ago with biometric passports, but there are still political issues that remain unsolved on the part of the European Union, and it's up to the European Union to decide whether this conditionality should be totally fulfilled or, as in the case of Ukraine, for instance, should be seen in a more flexible way in order to convey a very important message to those countries fighting for their independence, fighting for democracy. That's an issue. Second issue is that it's a very, perhaps, not so easy argumentation to talk about illegal humanitarian immigration. These people do not apply for visas, they do not have passports, they just try to escape from a certain death. So when they come to the frontiers of Europe They don't have passports. They still cross the frontiers of Europe. We are talking mainly about Syria. These people had no place to go within Syria. They're all in Turkey.
And the refugees is a major hot potato issue here. You know, especially as Brussels and Ankara talk. I understand. Ivana, I'm going to be losing your window in the next few seconds, so I'm going to wrap the discussion. It's been a pleasure having all your perspectives on Ivana Klimpish, Tsintsadze, Emre Gönen, and Nikolai Gorshkov. I thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Still to come on the Newsmakers are protesters in Morocco's long-neglected Rif region demanding more than just jobs. And Iraqi forces are set to clear out Daesh's last stronghold in Mosul. But what's the morning after plan? It's a tragedy that sounds similar to the one that sparked a wave of unrest across North Africa more than 6 years ago. Back in October, a vendor in Morocco's Rif region was crushed as he tried to salvage his catch that was confiscated by police. Since his tragic death, the country has been hit by mass protests. The government has responded with a harsh crackdown that has jailed dozens, including a prominent protest leader. Demonstrators say they are angry at corruption and poor job prospects. But is there something deeper at hand? Shoaib Hassan explains.
It was a shocking moment. A frustrated local fisherman in Al-Rif crushed to death in the back of this garbage truck. Mohsin Fikri had jumped in to protest the confiscation of his catch, and the officers responded by turning on the machine. It led to a storm of protests by outraged locals.
We came to condemn this odious crime against martyr Mohsin Fikri. We strongly condemn what we have seen with our own eyes. This is a premeditated crime.
The protests have since grown into a resistance movement. It's called Hirak al-Shabi, or the Popular Movement, and it's calling for the state to do more to create jobs and social infrastructure in the impoverished Al-Rif region. It's got the government worried. Al-Rif was the springboard for Morocco's part of the Arab Spring protests in 2011. Spreading across the country, they resulted in King Mohammed VI handing over part of his total power as monarch to an elected assembly. But the king still remains very pivotal, as he demonstrated in breaking a recent political deadlock to bring in a new coalition government that consolidates his position. That's something the original protests had campaigned against.
Our will is very strong, despite the attempts of the state to annihilate this movement, which claims only social, economic and cultural rights, as well as the lifting of the military status that enclaves this region and which prevents the investors from coming.
Nasir Zefzafi was an unemployed former bouncer from Al-Rif. He's now the face of the movement. The government initially tried to send officials to placate the locals, but his failure to do so led to them cracking down. The government now calls the movement separatist and has arrested its prominent figures.
They attacked us at the house as if it were in the movies. It was ferocious. Men dressed as ninjas. It's as if we were building explosives in the house. They were 20 people. They got my brother up and destroyed our house. Our parents were very scared. It terrified us.
Zefzafi is among those taken into custody, and that crackdown has transformed the peaceful protesters into mobs battling the security forces. It's also ignited demonstrations across the country, people coming out in solidarity with Al-Rif and what they say is the government's continuing inability to reform a flawed political economy. Shoaib Hassan, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Rabat is Mohammed Shtatu. He's a political analyst who specializes on politics, culture and terrorism in the Middle East. And from Provence in France is Abu Bakr Jamai. He's the founder of lacomid.com a news website that focuses on reporting political events throughout Morocco. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Mohammed, if I can begin with you. Many people looking at the story from the outside find immediate similarities between Mohsen Fikri, a fishmonger who had his stuff confiscated, ended up dying in the process, and Mr. Bouazizi in Tunisia in 2011. Is that the way Moroccans see it?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the similarities are striking. The same thing happened in Tunisia with Bouazizi. In Mohsen Fikri was an unemployed fishmonger who was trying to make a living, but he was ostracized by the police, etc. But we have to remember that the region itself, Al-Hoceima and the Rif, is a region that is marginalized, and this has been going on for over 60 years. There is no infrastructure, there are no factories, no universities, no schools, nothing. And the people of the region are Berber, Amazigh people speaking different language. And they had in the past some problems with the central government because there were uprisings in 1958 and in 1984, and they were badly treated by the central government. So this time, after this fishmonger was killed, people feel humiliation, and they call it hugra. And this humiliation is the fact that the government only comes to beat them, and they don't care about doing things for them, like investment, like bringing jobs and things like that. Right. I would like to say also that in the past, people used to go to Europe to work. Not anymore, and there are lots of expatriates in Holland, in Belgium, in other parts of Europe that sent money to their families, remittances to their families, but not anymore. So there are lots of young people who went to the university, studied, got degrees, but they are unable to get jobs, and that is why they are asking for social justice, that this region should be treated like all the rest of Morocco. Okay. And they're calling it the region of despair. And the other parts of Morocco, there is investment. Okay, some interesting points there. Now, before I talk about the crackdown on the protesters, and I'll ask both of you about it, Abu Bakr, would you concur with Mohammed that given the specific context, many of the issues that he mentioned, the fact that it's a region that's somewhat more rural and not urban, it's seen as marginalized, you have mainly ethnic Berbers there and not Arabs. You have a history of it being maybe ignored by the central government. Because of all of that, maybe we should be a little bit cautious about the Arab Spring similarities, because a lot of the uprisings that happened with the Arab Spring came from the centers of power, they came from the capital cities in other North African and Arab states.
Well, to begin with, and sorry to contradict the last sentence you've just mentioned, in Tunisia, which is the poster child of the Arab Spring, the uprising did not begin in Tunis. It begins in Sidi Bouzid, which is not the most important city in Tunisia. Well, I have to defer with my friend's assessment. I do think, as he said, that there are some specificities which concerns the region and Al-Hoceima and the Rif. But unfortunately, when you dig deeper, there are some structural issues which are systemic. If there is one consensus about the Arab Spring, is that there is one common denominator to all the uprisings, is that the avant-garde of these uprisings were led by urban unemployed youth, and generally urban educated unemployed youth. And if you look at what happened in Morocco since 2011, this data actually worsened. We have more urban educated unemployed youth all over Morocco than we had back in 2011, and that means that the system, the institutional architecture that has been put in place in 2011 simply did not work. We probably don't have time to go into the details about how Al-Hoceima is illustrative in many respects of what's happening elsewhere. By the way, the Hoceima region is not the poorest region in Morocco. The poorest region in Morocco, you might be shocked by that, is the region of Marrakesh, it's the house. So even when we think about the Rif as being a downtrodden region and especially impoverished region, it's not true that it is the poorest region. There is another region which is worse than the Hoceima. Okay, good points. Let's talk about the government's response. Now, many people calling for the king to do more. They're saying the king must step in, and I guess people are waiting for
for something to happen. So far, the authorities have cracked down. They've arrested hundreds. They've also arrested this man, Nasser Zefzafi. Was that the wrong decision to make by the authorities, Mohammed, given that they called Zefzafi a threat to national security?
Yeah, I think it's wrong. I think they went too far. I think the crackdown itself is not necessary because the uprising itself is peaceful from the very beginning. It was done in a very well-organized way. The people there were very disciplined, and all they wanted is equal justice, is social justice. They want jobs. They want more infrastructure. They want more hope in the future. And I think the government used too much force, and they cracked down on all the leadership. And rather than opt for an all dialogue, I think now it's very difficult for the government to do anything, simply because Morocco, there are no political parties. They've been all co-opted by the establishment, and they have lost any credibility in the eyes of the government and also in the eyes of, and mostly in the eyes of the people. People don't want the political parties because they know they are all paid by the government and they cannot speak in their name. So I think what the government should do is go for a dialogue, is build bridges of trust before doing anything else. Now, cracking down on these people and putting them in prison doesn't solve the problem. Al-Hoceima is in total uprising now, and there are also people who are talking about that probably they should end the peaceful uprising and go to something else. I hope they don't, but I think everybody is waiting for the king to step in as soon as possible. Maybe probably before Al-Eid, he will release all the political detainees and start discussion with these people, not with the elected people, because the elected people do not represent, and I emphasize that, do not represent the population of this region.
Abu Bakr, it started off as economic. I mean, many of the grievances are very sort of hand-to-mouth economic grievances, but the longer this goes on, is it becoming more and more political?
Well, I think it's a little bit more subtle than that, because when you analyze the slogans, they're not economic. They are in the political economy realm. In other words, people more and more are relating their economic problems with the institutions. So we are really in the realm of political economy. We're not in the realm of pure economics. So people are clearly relating corruption, relating bad governance with their dire economic situation. In other words, what they're questioning are basically the institutions of the country. And it makes it even harder for the government, because you cannot deliver on the spot roads and hospitals and universities, which is basically what the demonstrators are asking. But the problem here is that the regime has lost its credibility, has depleted its political credibility tank, because it already pulled that card before in 2011, right. And it didn't work. So hence the violence of repression.
Do you think they just deferred it back in 2011? They sort of bribed the population for a few years, but now all those underlying issues are coming to the fore?
In a sense, I would say that what happened, and this is the big difference with 2011. The big difference with 2011 is that the PJD, the Party of Justice and Development, which at the time had some credibility and basically decided to support the king's approach to the crisis in 2011 by supporting the constitutional process, etc., has itself depleted its credibility. In other words, the shock absorber that the PJD was then is no more. So what we have today, and that's what the situation is dangerous, is that the monarchy and the power elites are really at the forefront of this confrontation without any meaningful shock absorber.
Well, so far, the protests are in the Rif region in Al-Hoceima. We'll have to watch this closely.
I would say also...
Jump in, Mohammed. Yes, very briefly, please, 20 seconds, because I've got to move on. But come in, Mohammed.
Yeah, I would like to say that the Hirak Shabi, or the uprising in Al-Hoceima, is the uprising of the whole of Morocco, because people have been waiting for changes, for the end of corruption, co-optation and representation in parliament. All the people, the politicians, are extremely corrupt, and I think the establishment has to move fast before this becomes really the uprising of Morocco and the Moroccan Spring.
Yeah, we'll be watching it very closely. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure getting a deeper understanding of what's going on in Al-Hoceima and in the broader country of Morocco. Thanks so much for joining us.
After repeated defeats in Mosul, Daesh has resorted to the use of new tactics, which can only be described as dirty and immoral tactics that have nothing to do with the rules of war and humanity. They are using civilians as human shields in order to delay ending terrorism in Mosul.
It's a battle that has turned out to be far costlier and bloodier than many expected. But after 9 months of heavy fighting, the fight for Mosul could be nearing its final phase. Iraqi special forces and federal police are advancing deeper into Mosul, closing in on the densely populated old city. It's the last district under Daesh control. The group is fighting back with mortar fire and car bombs, attacking police positions across the city. Narrow alleyways have also slowed the Iraqi advance, forcing gun battles to take place street by street. Caught in the middle are nearly 150,000 Iraqi civilians who are trapped inside the besieged city. The UN estimates that about 230 civilians have been killed in the past 2 weeks alone, many from heavy bombing from the air. For the Iraqi government, taking the old city will be a major milestone in its battle against Daesh, who has seen its territory across Iraq and Syria dwindle. Well, joining me now from Karbala is Ali Dabbagh. He's the former Iraqi government spokesman, and from Washington, D.C. is retired Brigadier General Mark Kimmett. He was the former Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs under U.S. President George W. Bush. Thanks so much, both of you, for joining us. Ali Dabbagh, if I can begin with you, sir. How long is it going to take? The Iraqi forces are closing in on the old part of Mosul. How long do you think it's going to take?
I think it will take a few more days. The problem that Iraqi forces in a big challenge right now because of the civilians, which has already been used as a human shield, as the report said, but more than 100,000, the report saying that, and this is a big challenge for the Iraqi government to end this battle in Mosul, and that is make the operation slow down, which they expect as the Iraqi military forces, they expect before Ramadan. And before June, it should be end. But I think that was too optimistic. I think it's a matter of days they will finish. But again, this is a war. Nobody could give a final day that when it could. But the final district, which is Al-Nuri Mosque, which is symbolic for ISIS, which they are, for them, is the end. They are going to fight till death. So there is no way for them to go out, and that is why you could see that it is so hard for the Iraqi military forces to declare that Mosul being cleared from ISIS militarily.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned the civilians. We're going to dive a bit deeper on the issue of civilians and a lot of the moral conundrums that emerge as a result of attacking the city when there are so many civilians. We're going to go into that in a moment. But first, let me ask General Kimmett, U.S. commanders have called it the toughest in urban warfare since World War II. Why are they saying that? What do they mean by that?
Well, first, I think everybody recognizes how tough street-to-street fighting is. Since World War II, the Great Siege of Stalingrad, which took almost a year to clear out that entire city before the Sixth Army surrendered, was the exact same kind of fighting, house-to-house, street-to-street, district by district. We had the same problem in Hue in North Vietnam, in 1968. The Russians had it in Grozny. But I think characteristically, if you are a defender, you want to fight in a city because you have the natural advantages of terrain, you have the natural advantages of small, contained streets, and in the case of a heinous group such as ISIS, you can also wrap yourselves around civilians.
Yeah, and that seems to be what they're doing. Ali Dabbagh, so let's say it's granted, Daesh are disgusting in their tactics. They use human shields, they use civilians, they don't care about those civilians. Having said all of that, the Iraqi security forces haven't had a good history of protecting civilians. In actual fact, if you ask Der Spiegel, if you ask Human Rights Watch, if you ask Amnesty International, and even the Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi himself, they've criticized the Iraqi security forces and they've criticized Hashd al-Shaabi militias for killing civilians. So as you mentioned, there are more than 100,000 civilians in Mosul, in the old city of Mosul right now. What's to guarantee that these people won't be harmed or even slaughtered by the liberators of this city?
Right. This is one more challenge which face Iraqi government as well as Ibadi. But you could see that the record in Mosul is much better than the one which is in Al-Anbar. Criticism in Al-Anbar was much more. And now, Iraqi, I am quite sure, and most of the people are sure that Iraqi government, they are trying their utmost in order to not to allow any uncontrolled groups to take hold of the civilians by any names, even under the name of they are ex-ISIS, they are fighters of ISIS. This is the job of a government only. When it goes out of the hand of the government, the problem arises. And I think that in Mosul, most of the measure which Iraqi government been taken to get the popular unit not in the front, not they are knocking the door, not in the front of the battle of Mosul.
So you're saying they've learned from the mistake. They're putting them at the back.
Not only learned from the mistake, taking a great measure and a strict measure against anyone who violate, because that spoiled all the victory in Al-Anbar by minor violation which has been taken. And that minor violation, it is a violation. It's a violation against the civilians, the arrested people till now, the people being criticized that there are people who's been arrested with no reason. But of course, under investigation. In Mosul, the record shows much less than what we had in Al-Anbar. And I think this is a good record. But at the end, keep in mind, this is a war. People are ISIS, they are, again, they just take out they shave their beards and they become normal as a civilians, and nobody knows what they are, what their background.
No, I hear you, but when I spoke to Saad al-Mutalibi last week, he was using the this is a war argument to say, well, when we see an ISIS, when we catch an ISIS, we're going to kill them, right? So some people use that excuse to justify the slaughter of civilians and Daesh suspects. So how can you actually guarantee that nobody's going to do that and kill innocent people?
This is against the rule of law. Even killing ISIS, should be sentenced in the court and in the normal jurisdictional authority. It's not the people who are on the site, they do the punishment or they do the revenge. This is again a violation and against the rule of law. And definitely this is whoever saying Saad or anybody else, I think this is against the law, and Iraqi government needs to take that measure. I think Abadi is taking that measure right now.
Okay, let's bring in General Kimmitt. General Kimmitt, the Iraqis are on the ground, and then you have the coalition taking care of the airspace. Now, there have been a number of coalition airstrikes, and some of them awfully deadly for civilians. Some data came out on June the 2nd, CENTCOM releasing information that 484 civilians were killed by coalition airstrikes in Iraq and Syria. There's a combination of the two during this campaign to defeat Daesh. Air Wars, who are quite respectable, they came out and said, hold on, that's actually closer to 4,000. As someone who was on the ground in Iraq for all those years, and you were also responsible for communication as well, I remember seeing you during all those press briefings, would the coalition deliberately be downplaying civilian casualties, sir?
No, I don't think the coalition nor the Iraqis are downplaying civilian casualties. As Ali said just now, they recognize that every civilian that is killed, first of all, is a tragedy to that family, but it also works against their efforts. But Imran, I think it's important to take a deep breath and realize that this notion of zero civilian casualty wars is possible. That's a fiction. Sure. It is unfortunate. Yeah, but it's also important to recognize. Let me finish. Let me finish.
Is the coalition and the Iraqis, are they taking the best available precautions? That's my question.
Of course they are. But again, a historical perspective. Civilians were intentionally targeted up until the last 50 years or so. The Germans intentionally targeted London citizens. There were fire bombings of entire cities of civilians. That was done as an act of war to break the will of the enemy.
But
what the Iraqis are doing and what the civilians, let me finish.
Okay.
What the Iraqis are doing and what the coalition is doing is going out of their way to use precision weapons, precision targeting for the express purposes of minimizing the civilian casualties. But suggesting that we can fight this purely clean war without civilian casualties, even if you use all of those precision targeting and precision weapons, it is an unfortunate fact of war that this happens, especially when you have an enemy like ISIS.
Some people use that as a cop-out.
Especially when you have an enemy. Well, listen, Ali, are you going to let me finish?
Nope.
Especially when groups such as ISIS are going out of their way to wrap themselves in civilians to create those civilian casualties. So the short answer is, yes, we take every possible precaution to use precision weapons and precision targeting, but there will never be a clean war, which is what I believe you are trying to impose upon this.
Hold on.
And that demonstrates a misunderstanding of war and a misunderstanding of the situation on the ground.
Okay, General Kimball, if I could come in. War is ugly, war is brutal, war is terrible. You've given a World War II historical analogy. If I may come back with one of my own. If you were representing the Allies or the UK government at the time of the bombing of Dresden, I wouldn't be questioning how evil the Nazis were to you, but if they were killing tens of thousands of civilians, which they were, I would ask, are you trying to minimize civilian casualties? That's all I'm asking. I'm not saying no civilian should die. I understand war. Is that fair?
Well, again, you answered your own question. In World War II and in Korea and in other wars, civilians were seen as open targets. It was a method of breaking the will of the enemy to understand that we would not only inflict war upon your soldiers, but upon your civilians. That is no longer done. It is no longer considered acceptable. We will minimize the risk of civilian casualties by precision targeting, by precision weaponry. I can tell you that the coalition probably waves off 9 out of every 10 potential targets that they could attack because of the risk of civilian casualties. But again, you can never eliminate the risk of civilian casualties in war, and to suggest that is foolhardy.
Okay, final question for Ali Dabbagh. This is ugly. It's getting uglier as the Iraqis and the coalition try to retake the old city of Mosul. How important is it, sir, that in conjunction with Mosul being retaken in Iraq from Daesh, that very soon afterwards, Raqqa is retaken and liberated across the border in Syria?
One of the problems which Iraqi government faced, that the Raqqa has been still is in the hand of ISIS. If could Raqqa, the attack on Raqqa and the getting rid of ISIS in Raqqa, it could make the thing easier in Mosul. But at the end, I think Mosul, the symbolic of Mosul, it is a caliphate location. It's a caliphate center. It's a caliphate place where there's a Nuri mosque, which is the God symbolic. When you get out Mosul, I think Daesh symbolically, even though they are in Hawija or they are in Tel Afar or in any other small district in surrounding Mosul, but symbolically that the Mosul when being taken, when Al-Nuri mosque being taken, this is the declaration that Mosul, ISIS is end in Iraq. It's not going to end. They are going to have to go on underground, definitely. They will use the other ideology of killing from the underground, their activities. But again, this is a symbolic that the declaration of cleaning Mosul from ISIS presence, this is very, very important and symbolic for the Iraq. And again, it is for ISIS, keep in mind, that ISIS, they are defending that location as it is symbolic for whole the state, the so-called Islamic State, which they are declaring and they are promoting everywhere in the region.
Okay, well, war is never clean. It's never without casualties, but we hope that Daesh is defeated in as humane a way as possible. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you, Ali Dabbagh and Brigadier General Mark Kimmitt. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
It's time to go off script. Istanbul, Paris, Brussels, London, Name any beautiful cosmopolitan city you can think of, and it's likely that Daesh has murdered innocent people there recently. Civilians are being slaughtered, society is traumatized. But just because we are unfortunately gaining greater experience of this phenomenon, it doesn't mean we're any wiser to it. Now that the battle for Mosul has Daesh on its last legs in Iraq and the emerging assault on Raqqa could see them lose their stronghold in Syria, we are told this is why they are lashing out as their territory shrinks. The more ground is lost, the more frequent attacks elsewhere. That's the theory. One problem, it might not be true. For example, serious research done by the likes of journalist Rukmini Kalimachi and other people who look at the court records, testimony of defectors, interviews with security officials, they take a close reading of Daesh's own words. All of this paints a more complicated picture. We know a little. We don't know a lot. For example, the theory goes that Daesh wants to hit the UK hard because it is losing ground. The data shows the organization and the individuals who are radicalized have been trying to attack the UK long before they started to lose ground. Here's another one. Poverty and a lack of education equals extremism. Yes, lots of disgruntled, marginalized, uneducated kids are ripe for exploitation. But the data is a little more complicated. Many Daesh recruits come from middle-class and even wealthy families. The recent Notre Dame attacker was a PhD student. Degrees and trust funds putting our nice, elegant theories to shame. Rich, educated kids can also succumb to bad ideas. Some have been practicing Muslims. Many had no history of adherence before their dramatic swing to radicalization. It's complicated, and it doesn't all make sense. But why should it? There isn't a single uniform theory or psychological profile of a terrorist, or how and why a terrorist group operates, especially one as elastic as Daesh. While we live in an age where there's a crazy appetite for constant analysis, and the market for the hot takes Twitterati and op-ed think tankerati is a busy one, it's okay to say, I'm not sure, I don't know. What do you think? That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Gupta. Next time, we debate whether FARC rebels still pose a risk to Colombia. Until then, I thank you for watching. Bye-bye.